Here's a sentence I heard from a client a few months back, almost word for word. I've been doing a job of a VP for 2 years. I'm still called a director. I make less than the person I trained who left and came back at a higher title. I haven't said anything because I don't know. It felt like begging. That's not a confidence problem. That's a communication problem. And it's one of the most common things I run into with people 15, 20, 25 years into a career. Sharp, capable, doing more than their title says, and completely unwilling to say so out loud. Today, we're going to fix that, not with a pep talk, with a plan. Welcome back to Live Without an Expiration Date. I'm Rich Jones. If you're new here, this show is for people in the second half of their working life who are done pretending the rules are the same ones they learned in year three of their career. They're not. And nowhere more is that more obvious than in how people handle asking for more. Here's a thing no one tells you. When you're 28, asking for more gets harder the longer you're in the workforce, not easier. When you're junior, the ask is almost expected, and everyone knows you're underpaid. Everyone assumes you'll job hop for a raise. Nobody blinks. By the time you've got 2 decades in, the ask carries weight with it that it didn't used to. You've got a reputation to protect. You've watched colleagues ask badly and get silently, quietly sidelined for it. You know exactly how a no will feel because you've felt it before. So a lot of very capable people just stop asking. They do excellent work and they wait to be noticed. And waiting to be noticed is not a strategy, it's a hope. I want to be clear about something before we go further. This episode isn't about entitlement. I'm not going to tell you that you deserve more because deserve doesn't move budgets. Organizations don't pay people what they deserve. They people, they pay people what they've been convinced they need to pay them to keep them, promote them, or expand what they're responsible for. That's not cynical. That's just how the machinery works. Once you understand that, the ask stops being about your feelings and starts being about their math. So today, three things. One, why? Why money? Why title? And scope are three separate conversations, not one. Two, how to build and deliver the actual ask, the language included. And three, how to read the answer you get, because half the people I talk to walk out of these conversations not knowing if they got a yes, a no, or a comeback later, and they treat all three the same. They're not the same. Let's get into it. Why the ask gets harder. Let's start with the psychology, because if you don't deal with this part, no script I give you later is going to help. There are three reasons that the ask gets harder as your career goes on. And I want to name all three because usually only one or two show up consciously. The third one hides. Reason number one, loss aversion. Early career, you don't have much to protect. A bad ask cost you a slightly awkward meeting. Later career, a bad ask feels like it puts the whole relationship at risk. Your standing, the trust you built, the years of goodwill. That fear is mostly imaginary, but it's also a very convincing imaginary. I've had clients tell me They didn't ask for a title change because they didn't want to rock the boat, as if the boat wasn't already headed somewhere without them in it. Reason two, you built an identity around being low maintenance. This one's sneaky. A lot of people in the second half of their career have spent 20 years cultivating a reputation as a person who doesn't make waves, who just gets it done, who's easy to work with. That reputation is genuinely valuable. I'm not knocking it, but it comes with a hidden cost. Asking for something feels like betraying the persona, like you're suddenly the difficult one. I'll tell you right now, asking clearly and professionally for what you've earned does not make you difficult, it makes you visible. Those are different things, and conflating them is how good people stay underpaid. Reason three, this is the one people don't say out loud. They're not actually sure they'd win the argument. 25 years in, you've got enough self awareness to know exactly where your case is strong and where it's soft. Maybe your results are excellent, but your visibility to senior leadership is thin. Maybe you've taken on scope, but you can't prove the business impact in numbers. That uncertainty, not fear of rejection, but a real accurate read that your case has a hole in it, is often what actually stops people from asking. And the fix on for that isn't confidence, it's better preparation. We'll get there. Here's a little dry truth from 25 years in financial services, mostly in the C-suite of credit unions. I've sat on the other side of the table more times than I can count. And I can tell you almost without exception, the executives who got turned down weren't turned down because they asked. They were turned down because of how they asked, or because they asked for the wrong thing, or because they asked at the wrong moment. Nobody I ever worked with got quietly blacklisted for asking a clear, well supported question about their compensation or scope. The people who got sidelined were the ones who complained instead of asked, who let resentment leak out sideways in the meeting instead of putting it on the table directly. Those are very different behaviors, and leadership can always tell the difference, even if you think you're hiding it well. So before we talk tactics, get honest with yourself about which of these three is actually running the show for you. Fear of the relationship, fear of the identity shift, or an honest, accurate sense that your case needs work. They each have a different fix. Money, title, scope. Three different conversations. Now let's get practical. This is the part people skip, and it's the reason so many people fail before they even happen. Money, title, and scope are not the same conversation. They have different owners, different timing, different evidence requirements, and different risk profiles for the person you're asking. If you walk in wanting all three at once, you're not making an ambitious ask. You're making a confusing one, and confusing asks get tabled. Let's take them one at a time. The money ask. Money almost always has the highest constraints and the least discretion attached to it because it usually runs through a budget cycle, a compensation band, or a formal approval chain that your manager may not fully control. This is the conversation where no, not right now, is most often true, a true structural answer rather than a soft rejection. And it's also the one where timing matters more than anything else you'll bring to the table. The evidence that works here is comparative and quantifiable. Market data for your role in the region, a clear accounting of your compensation compared to your internal peers, if you can get that information. Documented impact translated into dollars wherever possible. Revenue influence, costs avoided, efficiencies gained. Vague impact statements do, do not move compensation committees. Numbers do. Timing matters enormously here. Asking for a raise mid-cycle outside of the budget planning window is asking your manager to fight a battle they may not have ammunition for, even if they agree with you completely. Find out when compensation planning happens in your organization and get your case in front of your manager 6 to 8 weeks before that window opens so that they have time to build it into the plan rather than scrambling to justify an exception. The title ask. This is a different animal entirely. It often costs the organization nothing in hard dollars, which means it can sometimes move faster than money. But it also means it can get treated as free and therefore low priority, which is its own trap. The title conversations are really about two things: external signaling, how you're perceived by clients, partners, the market, and internal alignment, whether your title accurately reflects the scope and seniority of what you're already doing. The evidence that works here is different from money. You're not proving dollar impact, you're proving scope mismatch. Show what you're actually responsible for versus what your title implies. Show who reports to you, formally or informally. Show the decisions you're making that a person with your current title typically wouldn't be making. If you can't find internal comparables, someone with a higher title doing comparable or lesser scope, that's power. If you can find internal care comparables, someone with a higher title doing comparable or lesser scope, that's powerful, but handle it carefully. This isn't about pointing fingers at a colleague. It's about establishing what the title actually means at your organization. The scope ask. Scope is the one people ask for least, and it's often the easiest lever to pull because it doesn't require budget approval or a title change process. It just requires your manager's confidence that you can handle more and a business reason to hand it to you. Scope conversations are frequently the on ramp to the other two. You expand what you're responsible for, you prove it out over 2 or 3 quarters, and then the money and title conversations get dramatically easier because you're not asking anymore, you're documenting. If you're early in rebuilding your case, or if you got a not now on money or title, scope is often your next best move. It's the lowest risk ask for your manager to say yes to, and it builds the evidence you need for the harder conversations later. Here's the practical takeaway. Figure out which one you actually need first and ask for that one. If you need all three eventually, sequence them. Scope, then title, then money, or title and money together if you're changing roles entirely, like moving into a new position. But don't walk into one meeting asking your manager to solve 3 separate organizational puzzles simultaneously. You'll get a sympathetic nod and nothing else. The conversation, what to actually say. All right, let's build the conversation. I'm not going to hand you a script to memorize because scripts fall apart the second the other person says something you didn't rehearse for, and they usually do. Instead, I'm going to give you a structure or parts. You fill in your own language, but you hit these beats in this order. Part one, open with the business context, not your feelings. Don't open with, I feel like I deserve, or I've been thinking about my career. That puts the whole conversation on emotional footing before you said anything substantive. Open with what's true about the work. Try something like, I want to talk about my role and make sure it's aligned with where things actually stand. Over the last year, I've taken on X, Y, and Z, and I think it's worth having a conversation about whether my title and compensation reflect that. Notice what that does. It's factual. It's not asking permission to have feelings about your job. It states a reality and proposes a conversation about aligning with it. Part two, present the evidence briefly. This is not the moment for a 20-minute PowerPoint walkthrough of your entire career. Two, maybe three concrete points. The strongest evidence you have, not all of the evidence. In the last 12 months, I've taken over the vendor relationships that used to sit with Jim. I led the integration project and came in under budget, and I'm now managing two direct reports that weren't part of my role a year ago. Specific, accountable, not, I've been working really hard. Hard is invisible and unpersuasive. Scope, outcome, and comparisons are visible, and persuasive. Part three, make the actual ask directly. This is where people get vague, and vague asks get vague answers. I was hoping we could look at my compensation at some point. Is not an ask, it's a hint. And hints are easy to nod at and forget. Say the thing. I'd like to work towards a title of X and a compensation adjustment that reflects that scope. Can we talk about what that process looks like and what timeline is realistic? You'll notice that's not aggressive. It's not an ultimatum. It's clear. Clear is not the same as harsh. And a lot of people conflate the two because they spent years avoiding directness in the name of being easy to work with. You can be direct and warm in the same sentence. In fact, you should be. Part four, ask a real question and then stop talking. This is the part almost everyone blotches. After you make the ask, most people get talking, filling the silence with justification, softening what they just said, apologizing for asking. Don't. Ask a genuine question. What would you need from me to make this happen? Or is this something we can work towards this cycle? Or is this the right target? Is the right target further out? And then be quiet. Let your manager think and respond. The silence is not a problem to solve. It's the sound of them actually considering what you said instead of being talked past it. One more thing on delivery, because it matters as much as the words. Bring this up in a real one-on-one, not a hallway conversation, not the end of an unrelated meeting, not a Slack message. Ask for 15 minutes specifically to discuss it so your manager comes in prepared rather than caught flat footed. Ambushing someone with a compensation ask, even accidentally, tends to produce a defensive answer instead of a considered one. Okay, a real example. Let me give you a composite example built from a few different client conversations because the abstract version only goes so far. A former client, a caller Denise, mid 50s, 22 years at the same organization, had absorbed an entire second department's worth of responsibilities over 18 months after a reorg eliminated a peer role. Her title never changed. Her pay never changed. She came to me frustrated and honestly a little checked out. The classic sign of someone who decided asking isn't worth it and is quietly updating her resume instead of having the conversation that might fix the actual problem. We didn't start with the ask. We started with the evidence because hers was scattered across 18 months of memory and nowhere on paper. We built a one-page summary, not a resume, just a scope comparison. What her role covered before the reorg and what it covered after. Who reported to her now that didn't before, and two concrete outcomes tied to that expanded scope. Then we sequenced it. Scope was already there functionally. The ask wasn't give me more to do, it was acknowledge what I'm already doing. That's a title and compensation conversation together because the scope change had already happened. Different situation than someone asking for expanded responsibilities they don't have yet. She used almost exactly the four-part structure I just walked through. Business context, brief evidence, direct ask, real question, then quiet. Her manager didn't say yes in that meeting. And that's worth pausing on because a lot of people expect an immediate yes and treat anything less as a failure. He said he needed to take it to HR and to his own boss, and he'd come back to her within 2 weeks with where things stood. That's not a no. That's not a not immediately. And it's actually the most common honest answer you'll get because most managers don't have unilateral authority to grant title and comp changes on the spot. 3 weeks later, a little past his estimate, which is normal, she got a title change and even an 11% increase. Not what she originally hoped for, which was closer to 18%. But she'd also learned going in that hers was a two-step negotiation, not a one-step ask. She's already got the next conversation on the calendar for the following review cycle. The point of that story isn't ask and you shall receive. It's that the evidence and the sequencing did more than the confidence did. She wasn't more confident than she'd been a year earlier when she stayed quiet. She was better prepared. Reading the answer you actually got. The last piece, and it may be the most important one, because I talked to a lot of people who had the conversation, got an answer, and then completely misread it. There are really four answers you get, and they require four different responses. The yes answer, great. But even here, get it in writing, get a timeline, and don't consider it done until it shows up in a paycheck or an offer letter. Verbal agreements evaporate under org changes, budget freezes, and manager turnover, often more than anyone wants to admit. The not now, but here's when and here's what needs to happen answer. This is actually the best realistic outcome for most first asks, and people underrate it constantly. If your manager gives you a specific timeline and specific conditions, let's revisit this at the mid-year review once the new budget's approved. That's a real commitment, not a brush off. Write it down. Send a follow up email summarizing what was discussed so there's a paper trail and so it doesn't quietly evaporate from memory in 4 months. Then hold them to the date you agreed on. The not now, with no timeline, no condition, just vague reassurance answer. It could be, we'll definitely look at that down the road. With nothing specific attached is not a commitment. It's a way of ending an uncomfortable conversation. If you get this answer, don't accept it as final. Go back and ask directly. What would need to be true for this to move forward? And roughly then ask, roughly when should I check back in? Force the vagueness into specifics. If they can't or won't give you specifics when asked directly, that itself is information. A flat no or repeated vague non answer over multiple attempts. This is the one people struggle to accept because it's the answer that suggests you might need to change the plan entirely rather than the pitch. If you made a well-prepared, evidenced ask more than once with reasonable time between attempts, you're you're still getting nothing, not a timeline, not here's what's blocking it, just repeated deflection, that's usually not a communication problem anymore. That's an organizational one. And that's a different episode worth of decision making about whether this is the place you're going to reorganize your growth or whether you've outgrown it. I'm not going to pretend that's a simple call. And I'm not going to tell you to quit on the spot. But I will tell you not to keep asking the same question the same way and expecting the fourth attempt to land differently than the first three. The mistake I see most often isn't a bad ask. It's a good ask followed by a misread answer, treating a real not yet like a rejection or giving up or treating a soft brush off like a genuine commitment and waiting quietly for months. Know which one you got and ask directly if you're not sure. Just so I understand, is this a timeline we're setting or is this not something that's likely to happen? That question feels blunt. Ask it anyway. Blunt beats month of misplaced hope. So, money, title, scope. Three different conversations, three different kinds of evidence, one structure you can use for all of them. Business context, brief evidence, ask direct, real question, then silence. If there's one thing I want you to leave with, it's this. The ask is not the risky part. The years of not asking, that's the actual risk. That's the one that costs you money, costs you standing, and costs you honesty. Some self-respect slowly enough that you don't notice it, that you're losing it. Until you're the person training your replacement at a higher salary than the one you're sitting in. You put in the years, put in 15 minutes to have the conversation. That's the show. If this one hit close to home, Send it to someone who's been meaning to have this conversation and hasn't yet. That's most of us at some point in our career. Subscribe where you're listening, and I'll see you next time on Live Without an Expiration Date.